Hello, today we're going to be going over Chapter 7, Gender and Sports. This is a very long PowerPoint, so I'm going to go through it fairly quickly and just add in points. I may not go over every single one. That way we can get through it in a timely manner. So go ahead and go to the first slide. So remember earlier on in the semester we talked about these ideologies. Well, here's one of the first one, gender ideology. And it really explains what gender ideology is. It's ideas, belief widely used to define masculinity and femininity. Identifies people as male or female, evaluates the form of sexual expression, and then organizes them into social groups. Okay? Gender ideology resists change, but it can and often does change as other parts of society change. So, as we talk throughout this, whole PowerPoint, one area would be transgender athletes. You're going to start to see how we really define gender ideology, with those athletes. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So gender ideology, is based on this idea of a two classification system. Gender ideology is you're male or you're female, and it's very black and white, and it assumes that you're heterosexual. That's what gender ideology is. It assumes that you are, heterosexual. It doesn't take any other assumptions into play. It leaves no space for those who do not clearly fit into those two categories. If you're not a male or a female, or you don't identify, a certain direction or a certain orientation, you don't fit into this gender ideology. Inferior. Women are inferior to men. When it comes to power and success. Go ahead to the next slide. Research across many scientific disciplines show that biological sex is not manifest in either or male and female terms. So biologically, your sex, it isn't really defined as male or female. It manifests across many traits and terms of shades of difference. Most societies, people are forced into a sexual category, so you have to identify yourself into a sexual category in almost all societies. And if they don't fit, you are socially unacceptable, okay? Being classified in one or another's normative category limits possibilities for all people. So, gender ideology really puts restrictions on society as a whole. Go ahead to the next slide. Gender ideology, a tool for maintaining the status quo. Males are identified as superb in terms of traits. Women are defined as inferior to men, and it's their ability, except for in their ability to nurture. So in their ability to be a parent, to take care of people, women are considered better at that. Leads social worlds to be male dominant, male identified, male centered. And a lot of the things that we're going to discuss today are all research-based, okay? So, this isn't just me as a female coming in and talking about these things. These are still things that are going on today. Go ahead to the next slide. Gender inequality issues always exist in sports cultures when they're male-dominated, when they're male-identified, and when they're male-centered, okay? Go ahead to the next slide. Facts about gender ideology, okay? Gives some men more access to power while restricting the range of behavior of men, okay? Marginalize gays, lesbians, and bisexuals and transsexuals by categorizing them out of the normal bounds, okay? Leads women to push gender boundaries while men are more apt to police gender boundaries. So men are going to make sure that, women aren't overstepping their boundaries, and it forces women to kind of fight more. Go ahead to the next slide. Gender ideology in sports, girls and women as invaders. So, females in certain sports maybe threaten traditional ideas about gender, okay? Through history, myths have been used to discourage participation by girls and women. A long time ago, in the 40s and 50s, they used to tell women if they participated in sports, they wouldn't be able to have kids, that it would, ruin their reproduction system. Later on in life, if you played sports, even in the 80s and stuff, you were never going to be able to get married. Men wouldn't find you attractive. So there's been this propaganda, if you will, disencouraging women to participate. Encouragement varies by sport, so depending on the sport will really depend if they want women to play it or not, okay? Being a tomboy is okay as long as there's traditional feminine cues are present. And, I always give this example to classes. For me as a coach, I'm a female in soccer coach, and there's not that many female soccer coaches. There's so many more males than females. And early on in my career, it was interesting. When I'm on the sidelines, I want to look like a soccer coach, but I also want to look like a female. So I always wear a nice ponytail. I always make sure that I have a nice polo on, cute shorts, good running shoes. I still want to look like a woman. I don't want to be associated as looking like a man. And that's all on me. But it's kind of these things you've been taught over time. You can do tomboyish things as long as you're still showing that you're a woman. Okay? Go ahead to the next slide. Throughout most of the 20th century, gender ideology led to the exclusion of females in sports. Okay? Prior to the 1970s, most girls in schools had, one or two what they called field days. So essentially they allowed women and girls one day, maybe 2 days a year to run around and have a field day. Go ahead to the next slide. Girls and women did engage in physical activity during the early 20th century, but those activities emphasized grace and beauty, and ladylike behavior, okay? A great movie, that depicts a lot of the stuff is A League of Their Own. If you haven't seen it, it's on the list. I strongly encourage you to watch it. It's loosely based on, World War II, and when, there wasn't enough men to play baseball, they started a women's league, and how they treated the women. Go ahead, and they really focused on being a lady and being ladylike in that movie. Go ahead to the next slide. Ladies, not invaders. Women wanted to play sports during the 20th century. They often named the team Lady This, Ladies That. I'm very appreciative that we're not the Lady Knights here, that we're just the Knights. Referred to themselves as lady to diffuse the threat to men. Today, the term lady does not come with these constraints, but lady teams continue to receive fewer resources than men's. Okay, go to the next source. Or the next slide, sorry. Gender ideology, you see this picture here, leads to many strategies when seeking opportunity to play certain sports. So this is a lingerie Super Bowl. So there is a lingerie league, there's a lingerie game for football, and it happens right around the Super Bowl time. So this is a picture from that. So women who want to play football, this is one way they can be involved, is through lingerie football. Go ahead to the next slide. Women's professional sport league struggles to thrive, including, the W League and in U.S. soccer. U.S. women's soccer, they have a new league. It is doing much, much better. They have better sponsors. They're better organized. There's a lot that goes into why these women's sports don't always do well. And it's not as simple as, well, people aren't watching them. It really has to do with how they're organized and the way they are, really communicated and sold to the public. Go ahead to the next slide. Mainstream sports reaffirm gender ideology, orthodox gender ideology, okay? So because gender is not a fix in biology, sports are key sites for maintaining ideas and beliefs about male and female differences. Sex tests for women are used to maintain two-sex classification, so you're either a male or you're a female. Sports, especially media sports, celebrate traditional masculine and natural power, towards males. Sports talk and sports images often glorify heroic manhood based on being a warrior. People use this legitimate male power and dominance in gender in relations. Go to the next slide. So sex testing, the book touched on this, is the legacy of two-sex systems. So essentially what they've done is said, if you have certain traits, then you're a male, even though you're a female. And, it's really been damaging, and there's, good examples of this within the book that you should really touch on. Go ahead to the next slide. And you can go ahead and skip this slide here. So I'm on the slide now, the current IOC approach to sex testing. It's invalid, it's discriminatory, it's unfair to women, it's psychologically harmful. I mean, it's not a good thing in what they're doing and testing women to make sure that they don't have enough, or they don't have too many male hormones, if you will, keeping it really simple. Go ahead to the next slide. Gender ideology and the double standards that there are in sports. So there's just some questions here. What would happen if Serena Williams beat up a man or a woman in a bar? I mean, that would not be acceptable at all. High-profile women athletes brag about having numerous sex partners. So if it was known as a female athlete, a really famous one, if you think about, Abby Wambach, okay, women's soccer player. If she was somebody who, came out and said she had numerous sexual partners and she was kind of a playgirl and made the rounds, that would not be acceptable. Where on the male side, it's almost a bragging right. So there's some other examples here as well, but go ahead to the next slide. So changes in gender ideology, prerequisite for gender equality. So, gender is a fundamental organization of principal life. Okay, this is how we function in our social world, males and females. It's not going away. Gender ideology influences how we think about ourselves and others, how we form relationships and evaluate them, present ourselves to others. So again, you're a male, you're a female. How do you present yourself? What do you look like on a day-to-day basis? Develop expectations for ourselves. There's standards, and there's, I think as an individual, you should think of some of those standards that you don't even realize that you hold yourself to because you're a male or because you're a female. Organize and distribution of rewards within the social worlds. Go to the next slide. Despite, gender ideology, there's been definitely some progress. So progress is due to legislation. So Title IX, which we're going to discuss here in great detail, the global women's right movement, global health and fitness movement, and the increased media coverage of women's sports. So the more people see women in playing sport, the more acceptable it's going to be. And, we talked about that, in other chapters. The more we get access to things, the more normal it becomes. Go ahead to the next slide. Fairness and equality issues revolve around sport participation patterns by gender. Gender inequalities relate to sport participation opportunities, support for athletes, and jobs and coaching administration. Okay, strategies for achieving equality opportunities for girls and women. Go on to the next slide. Here is Title IX, and if there's one thing that you have to take away from this chapter, I please want you to take away understanding what Title IX is. So I'm going to read through it, and then we're going to discuss it in more detail. No person in the United States shall, based on sex, be excluded from participating in, be denied benefits of, or subject to discrimination under any educational program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. Title IX was started, okay, and you're going to watch a video this week related to Title IX. Title IX was started as an educational law because women were trying to get into college. This wasn't developed for sports, and there's so much more that goes into Title IX. A big perception is, Title IX was developed to allow women to play sports. No, it's really based on any educational program. Any educational program, nobody can be discriminated based on sex, and that includes males. It's not just for females. The key thing I want you to take away too, receiving federal assistance. Okay, so any school that is receiving federal money must abide by these laws. Hence, earlier when we were talking about private programs within youth sports, they don't have to abide by these laws because they're private. Now, some of you are saying to yourself, well, Wartburg's a private college, so then why do we have to follow Title IX? We receive federal money, even though we're a private school. We have students receiving federal loans. So we are receiving financial assistance from the government. We have to abide by these laws. Go ahead to the next slide. The law passed in 1972 as an educational bill, as I stated. So Title IX requires, 3 tests, and you have to be in compliance of one of these 3 tests. So essentially, you're in compliance of Title IX if your school, your organization is, following this one policy. So there's, the 5% point deviance has been okayed. There's a history of progress. So judged by the action and progress over the last 3 years. So you're making progress to become, closer. The accommodation of interest tests. So programs and teams meet the interests of the abilities of the underrepresented sex. Okay, so essentially that you have programs and teams for the sex that's underrepresented. Go ahead to the next slide. So Title IX in the U.S. has fostered major changes in participation for females, okay, in general. Again, it was invoked in 1972 as a law, demonstrated that laws and enforcement do not just exist in a social vacuum, demonstrated that when laws change the ideas of lifestyles with people in power, the legitimacy, the enforcement of laws will be questioned. So what they're saying was when this first came into play, and for a long time, People didn't even follow it because the people that were in power didn't believe in it and they didn't think it was right. Go ahead to the next slide. So Title IX arguments. Women's sports don't pay for themselves. So this idea that, well, I don't understand why we need to add a women's sport if they're not going to make any money. There's lots of sports and organizations at colleges and at high schools that don't make money, okay? Marching bands, cheerleaders, debate teams, choirs, student governments, and nobody talks about those, and they just focus on women's sports. Football pays for everyone in athletics. This is a huge myth. Now, understand the big dog schools, okay? We're talking Alabama, we're talking Michigan. Those are schools that are making money through their football program. The majority of Division I, Division II, Division III schools, football programs are not making money. If anything, they're losing money for the school. Studies have shown that all D1 schools have major losses each year, and average losses is under $10 million. And this goes because of equipment costs, stadium upkeep, head coaches' salaries, staff salaries, and roster size. So this notion of, well, they make the money is just not true. Again, there's like the big dogs, and you're going to talk about 10 to maybe 20 schools that are always going to be, making a lot of money for their institution. But outside of that, it's just not happening. Go ahead to the next slide. So football is a sport that puts pressure on athletic budgets in every athletic department. 85 athletic scholarships for Division I, 53 players on an NFL team. Travel size, travel party of 60 to 70. So what this stat is telling you that is on a professional team, there's only 53 players. On a college team, they have 85 scholarships. That doesn't even count the people that are on the team that aren't receiving scholarships, okay? So it's a huge number of people on these teams, okay? Go ahead to the next slide. Football pays for everyone. We touched on this, huge myth. No one would argue that they don't make large amounts of revenues, but they also lose it. We've already gone over this. We can go to the next slide. Gender inequalities remain in the U.S. and worldwide. So unfortunately, even though we have Title IX, there's still a lot of improvement for the United States in general. Significant inequalities remain in the participation rates, compared males to female, support given to female athletes, and access to power positions in women's sports. So when they talk about access to power positions, we're talking about head coaches, we're talking about administrators, we're talking about women being in charge of large organizations related to sports. There's just still not that avenue for them to do that. Go ahead to the next slide. So categories for support for athletes, access to facilities, quality of facilities available of scholarships, program operating expenses, recruiting budgets. Recruiting budgets really vary depending on the sport and the sex, scheduling of game and practice times, travel per diem. Per diem means the amount of money that you get to travel per athlete. Academic tutoring, number of coaches, salary for all staff and administrators, medical training services and facilities, and then publicity for the players, the teams, and the events that are going on. Go ahead to the next slide. So facing football. So high-profile teams involve more players, more resources than any other sport. Understand with Title IX, in general, football is treated as a separate entity, okay? So, when you're talking about, they keep them outside over here, that they don't really count towards school because it's just a separate sport. You can't make it comparable to any other sport. Promote a culture in which there is resistance to gender inequality, often are supported by boosters who see gender inequality as an obstacle to the way they want to do things. So typically boosters within football programs see gender inequality as something that's getting in their way to be successful. Okay? You can go ahead to the next slide. When football is a culture and the structure, the centerpiece of the school, community, gender inequalities are likely to exist and persist over time. I would just ask you, to ask yourself, what was football like for you at your high school? Was it something that was overshadowed everything? Was it something just in the norm, in the mix? And I think everybody would have a little bit different experience, compared to some others. Go ahead to the next slide. So here's just some percentages of head coaches, female head coaches within sports. And as you can see here, in the 70s, it was significantly higher than it is, in 2012. Now, we're in 2016, so these stats are a little bit old and, need to be updated. But like if you look at women's soccer, for example, it's definitely changed quite a bit in the regards of how many women, female head coaches there are. I go to a convention almost every year in January, and there's over 10,000 soccer coaches, and it's college, club, high school, youth. So, I mean, it's all levels that are there, professional. And it's something crazy. It's like 2% of the people attending are female. And I can feel it when I'm there. I'm in a room full of males. And it's a really interesting place to be. For example, at this convention this year when we signed in, when you registered, they had very beautiful models. I kid you not, like 10 to 12 tall, beautiful models, inviting all of us to attend like an open house party for all the coaches attending this convention. Now, do you think they really came up and talked to me? No. They were targeting the males. And, just little things like that you're like, wow, it's 2016 and this is what I'm dealing with. And this is the reality of, they're catering to the males that are there. They don't really care about the females that are attending. Go ahead to the next slide. Coaching and administration, reasons why there's not as many females in these roles. Women are not considered for all of half coaching positions, okay? For example, when I was applying to be a head coach, I was only applying to be a women's head coach. Well, males in this field, they'll apply to both male and female jobs, regardless of their experience, and they'll be considered for either or. Where if I applied for a male's job, I'd have a much more difficult time, being considered because I don't have the experience and I'm a female. Where on the male side, I've seen plenty of males get hired on the women's side who have had no experience with females. There's just that double standard there. Women lack fully developed and effective networks to compete with men. So even I run into the situation of, there's all these male coaches that are buddies and they knew each other, they played with each other, and just to even break into those networks and make friends. I've made my own networks and I, done my own thing, but it's definitely difficult. Search committees often have members who, use those orthodox gender ideologies to assess job positions. So, they look at it black and white. Well, it's a male's team. We need a male's coach. So that's typically why you're not seeing women get into these positions. Many women lack the support system and professional development opportunities that men have had. Okay, so just the support system in general. Go ahead to the next slide. So it continues on with some things. Many women avoid careers in sports organizations that are male-dominant, male-identified, and male-centered. Women get out of, coaching all the time, or administration. Women experience more sexual harassment, which sets them up to fail and discourage them from seeking upward mobility. Go ahead to the next slide. Barriers to gender inequalities, okay? So budget cuts, privatization of programs, resistance to government regulation. So these are all, essentially these 6 things here are listing, the barriers. So things that are stopping gender inequality. Few models of women in positions of power. Even for myself, I didn't grow up with one female coach. I had all male coaches growing up in all sports that I played. And I'd ask you females and males in our class, think to yourself, how many female coaches did you have, and at what level did you have them at? Did you have them at the varsity level, club level, maybe at the collegiate level right now? Maybe some of you are currently on a team that has a female coach, but you just don't have those role models to show you, that it's an acceptable position. Culture emphasized on, cosmetic fitness for women. They trivialize women's sports and male-dominant, identified and centered sports organization. Go ahead to the next slide. Events for men have always outnumbered events for women in the Olympics. So obviously the Olympics are coming up here in August, so I'll have some new stats on that. But as you can see, there's always more male sports than female sports. Another slide just about the Paralympics and, individuals that are allowed to be involved. You can go to the next slide. So gender inequality and sexuality. Sports have long been associated with males being heterosexual and the expression of, homophobia. and growing rejection has led to the desires for change. So challenges from the LGBTs continue, okay, to exist, and LGBTs worldwide are careful to keep identities hidden. So what they're saying here is if you're, gay and or that you try to keep it hidden in the sports world, that it's just still not acceptable, especially in male sports. It's been really difficult. There's been lots of struggles for male athletes to be able to come out at all levels. Major League Baseball, the NFL, the NBA, even in the soccer world, it's been very difficult. Go ahead to the next slide. Challenge of being gay or lesbian in sports, okay? So popular discourse erases gay men and lesbians from sports completely. Gay men and lesbians have less freedom than heterosexuals when it comes to expressing their sexuality. However, that's definitely changing. If you watched the World Cup at all last summer, obviously the U.S. women won, if you didn't watch it. And after they won, Abby Wambach ran right over to her wife, gave her a big kiss and hug, and, they showed it on TV. So we're slowly becoming a society that is becoming more accepting, but at the same time, we still have so much ground to make up. Being out in sports creates challenges. Women are at risk for not being accepted, and men are at risk for physical harm and acceptance as well. Most people in sports support the don't ask, don't tell policy. Like, just don't talk about it. Like, let's not talk about it, and I don't really care, because I don't want to hear about it. Go ahead to the next slide. Martina was a very famous tennis player in the early 80s, and she came out as a lesbian, and she lost millions. And I know we're talking that's almost 30 years ago, but at the same time, this was somebody who was really a barrier breaker, and you're going to be writing a paper this week about an athlete that's broken barriers. She was definitely one of them. She came out, she stood by who she was, and she's still somebody who's an activist and really started the conversation, as the slide says. Go ahead to the next slide. Homophobia, okay? It defines it in the book, discusses it. It's generalized as fear or intolerance of anyone who clearly isn't classified as a heterosexual male or female, okay? So people are afraid of them. They have no tolerance for them. They don't like them, okay? That's what homophobia is. It's a powerful cultural factor that affects everyone because it creates fear and pressure to be a certain way, to be normal, okay? Go ahead to the next slide. Intersex and transgender persons in sports. So, this slide goes into great detail about transgenders. So essentially, like the first bullet point, it describes, transgender describes an individual whose gender identity, their physical makeup, does not matches the person, psychologically, okay? This has been a very, very hot topic lately. Obviously, right now, you're seeing a lot of discussion, and if you haven't, check out the news about restrooms, what restrooms are transgenders allowed to use and not allowed to use. There's been places where they're putting strict policies. North Carolina came out and made a law that, your biological makeup, that's the bathroom that you had to use. Then everyone started to boycott it, and now they've changed the law. Target has come out and said, whoever you identify as a person, that's the restroom that you can use. This is going to be a topic that we're going to have to discuss and analyze within the sports community. This is even new to me. How are we going to classify individuals within sports? Because transgender, at this point, how sports are laid out, okay, not the way I lay them out, but in general, how we've laid them out, they don't fit in. We talked about that in a couple slides ago. They don't fit in. You're either male or you're female. You can't be both. You have to identify with one. And if your physical makeup, according to sports, matches a male, then you're a male, even though psychologically, you identify yourself as a female. So it's going to be a real challenge, in the tough discussions to understand how we're going to go about this. Essentially, our system isn't working for us, and we have to find a new way to discuss norms and how to classify individuals within sports. Go ahead to the next slide. Why we must address, these issues, okay? Our core values and laws demand it. So transgenders can legally not be excluded. We just got done talking about Title IX. Nobody, based on their sex, can be excluded from activities. So, it'll be interesting to see how this goes about. And this is new for me, and I keep trying to educate myself. And I think 5 years from now, when I'm teaching this class, if I'm still teaching this class, it'll be really, really different. But what I can say is that you just got to keep yourself informed, and, don't come to, absolutes and things. Really keep yourself informed and try to learn as much as possible. Research has shown the number of transgenders are also growing. Okay, so that's why we need some change. Go ahead to the next slide. Strategies to achieve equality. Okay, so we need to use laws and grassroots activism, showing boys and men that there are benefits to gender equality and recruiting them as allies for making change. So teaching our sons, our brothers, our husbands, our friends that it's a good thing that women are successful. And I'm lucky enough, I have a husband who's incredibly supportive of women in athletics, and he was heavily involved in athletics and still is. So, making them allies to help, with change. And then changing the way we do sports. We just talked about it. I think there's going to be an overhaul of how we approach sports and, what that really looks like. And it may not be so black and white moving forward. Go ahead to the next slide. Strategies to promote equality, okay? So one thing is, confront discrimination and be an advocate for women coaches and administrators. And that's what I've tried to do in my position, is to be an advocate for women coaches and administrators. Be an advocate for fair and open employment practices. Keep data on gender equality. Learn and educate others about the history of discrimination in sports and how to identify discrimination. There's a lot of misconceptions, a lot of myths out there that, certain things, Title IX just takes away men's sports, which is not true at all. So really educating individuals about, gender equality. Go ahead to the next slide. Okay, we got some more strategies in promoting. So informal media and unfair discrimination policies, package women's sports as revenue producers, recruit women athletes into coaching. And, coaching, that's one area that's really difficult to get women to do due to the hours that we have to spend, some of the misconceptions behind it. And you see women a lot of times get out right after they have kids because, they're not able to spend as much time with their families. Use women hiring networks, okay, and create a supportive climate for women within your own organization. Go to the next slide. Strategy for changing the culture, okay? So alternative definitions to masculinity, alternative definitions to femininity, and changing the way we do sports. Those are 3 ways we can start to change our culture. So again, change the way we, define masculinity, change the way what we define as femininity, and then change the way we do sports, and just make some adjustments into our vocabularies and who we include and who we don't include, okay? Go ahead to the next slide. Girls and women being agents of change, okay? Sport participation can empower women, but it does not automatically make, them agents of change. You see plenty of women who are heavily involved in sport and don't want to do anything about changing and making it more. Personal empowerment does not always lead to awareness of the need of, for gender transformation in society as a whole. Elite athletes seldom act as agents of change when it comes to gender ideology. The U.S. women's soccer team, though, is a great example of women being an agent for change. They have been suing the U.S. Soccer Federation for equal play with the men. Again, I don't want to take up your time talking too much about it, but look it up. It's a fantastic situation that they've been fighting for. Go ahead to the next slide. Elite female athletes seldom change traditional ideology because they don't want to be, perceived as a radical, a feminist, a lesbian. Even I have a hard time sometimes when I'm talking about this chapter with our class that, people are going to be like, oh, she's just a crazy female who's, wants women everywhere. So, women are really hesitant to do that because they don't want to be labeled a certain way. Focuses on individualism, consumption. It's not everyday struggle is related to gender. Empowerment discourse in sports often are tied to fitness and heterosexual attractiveness. Women athletes have little control or political voice in sports and society as a whole. That's just how it is. Go ahead to the next slide. So men being an agent of change, okay? So it creates options for men to play sports that are not based on just power and performance. It emphasizes relationships, on cooperation rather than just conquest and domination. It provides opportunities for boys and men to learn how to maintain emotionally satisfying relationships. Go ahead to the next slide. Oh, that is our last slide. So I know this was a long PowerPoint. I went through some of the points fairly quickly. Some things I didn't discuss, as I said earlier. With Title IX, one thing I want to point out that I missed was there's this perception that women's sports take away from men's sports. It's not that clear, okay? It's not that simple, and the book kind of discusses that with you. With Title IX, it's all about equal funding for programs depending on numbers and such. So when schools cut male sports, it's because they don't want to take money from other male sports, okay? So meaning, a couple years ago, well, it's been actually quite a while now, you and I cut baseball from the program to add additional women's sports because they weren't in compliance, okay? So everyone just looks at it as, well, they're adding a women's team and they're cutting a male's team. Well, that's not necessarily the case, okay? There's other ways they could have allocated money, made some decisions, but they decided the best way to become equal was to cut the male's baseball team. If you have more questions about Title IX, if the book, if the lecture, the video doesn't really clear it up, please email me, okay? I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have. Thanks.